There's a new edition of Necromunda, which means it's a great time to get some gangers ready for the Underhive. And those gangers are going to need some suitably grimy industrial bases to stand on. So today I'm going to show you how I painted these industrial bases with hazard stripes and a bit of toxic waste. And if you're just looking for something quick and effective, I'll also show you a good place to stop before we add some of those extra details. So put the kettle on, grab your paints, welcome back to Tea Time Tabletop. So these Necromunda bases are really nice and detailed, but they lack that bit of sort of crusty dirt that I imagine the Underhive is full of. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a bit of Sterland mud and just getting some of that dirt into those cracks, sort of getting it in there and making the base feel a little bit more grimy, a bit less sterile than it otherwise looks. And you could do this with, sand and PVA glue or probably any other sort of texture paint. I'm not doing it everywhere, just doing it in a few little places, just to give a bit more interest to the base. Alright, so once that's done, we leave it to dry, and then we prime the whole miniature. And I've decided to prime it in grey cere, which is a sort of light off-white colour. I thought a lighter colour would be nice because that'll let me get a bit more colour into those dark recesses you'll see later. Alright, so when I imagine the Underhive, I'm imagining lots of greys, basically concrete, I think they call it rockcrete in the Necromunda lore, and maybe some metals as well. So I'm starting off with a grey colour, but I quite wanted a slightly bluish grey to give some of that more industrial feel. So here I've gone for Eshin grey. Eshin grey is a layer paint, not a base paint, so it's not got wonderful coverage, so it might need to go on in 2 coats. But we're not going to be too fussed about whether we get it all into those little cracks and details, because we're going to dirty those up later anyway. But yeah, so Eshin grey for this one. Alright, and once that's all done, we're going to now start dirtying the base a bit more. So I'm taking some Agrax Earthshade and I'm putting it quite heavily into all the recesses on this base. So I'm going into these little nooks and crannies here, and I go down deep into all of these deep lines in the bases. And I do this all over, but then I try and avoid getting the flat panels too brown. So afterwards, I take a wet brush and wick back up some of the wash that's gotten onto those flat panels, just to keep them with that grey colour. So we've got a nice brown in the crevices, but we retain our grey on top. Okay, so now it's looking dirtier, but we'd like to get a bit more of that sort of rusty, grimy, almost orangey colour into the recesses, I think. So I've taken Scrag Brown, heavily watered it down so that it flows into the sort of corners and crevices, and I'm just strategically putting it around the base. So I'm not putting this absolutely everywhere. I'm just picking some crevices, creases in the base that I like the look of, and I'm giving them a bit of this extra rusty brown colour. Alright, so now we've successfully dirtied the base down, it's time to bring back some of those highlights and make it pop a bit more. So I'm taking Administratum Grey and I'm giving it a dry brush all over. This is a fairly heavy dry brush. We're not just hitting the absolute edges of the base, I'm also quite happy to get a bit of the dry brush texture onto the flat panels as well. I think this just gives it a bit more pop, a bit more visual interest. Alright, so here we've got our safe stopping point. If you just want a quick and easy industrial base, we've done a bit of washing and a bit of a dry brush, and I think this actually looks pretty nice as it is. You could leave it here and be perfectly happy, I think. But I'm going to show you a couple of ways for us to elevate this base with some more details. So the first thing is your absolute classic of Warhammer 40,000 and Necromunda, the hazard stripe. So I've taken a nice yellow here, Avalon Sunset, that is a base colour, and it actually goes on with quite a lot of coverage, so it goes on pretty well straight onto the grey. So once we've done that, we've got a nice yellow stripe. We're going to start sketching on some stripes in black. So you can see me there testing the flow on my thumbnail. I've taken some Abaddon black and I've thinned it down a little bit just to make it flow slightly nicer off the brush, so I can be a little bit more accurate with this. And so I'm sketching on where I want these stripes to be. I'm not aiming for this to be the final stripe, so I don't mind if the coverage is a bit low because the paint's a bit thin. It's going to come out a bit grey, because we're going to go back over it after I've sketched out where they are, if you see. So we sketch out where we want the stripes, and then we go back over with the paint less thinned to get nice coverage and get those stripes looking nice. Alright, hazard stripe looks nice, but it's a little bit too neat. So we're gonna sponge on some grub and dirt. So I quite like using these bits of packing material you sometimes get with some of your miniatures. I just tear a bit off and I have dipped it here in a bit of Rhinox hide. I've taken quite a lot of it off and then I'm just gently sponging on the Rhinox hide across the base to give it a bit more of that sort of grubby, used, dirty texture that the underhive should be like. Maybe this is sort of oil, or maybe it's just, you know, decades of grub. Okay, now in a Blue Peter style, here's what I made earlier. UK children from the 90s will know what I'm talking about. I've got a second base, and this one I'm gonna add a sort of toxic goo effect. Maybe this is spillover from a chemical plant or something down in the depths of the underhive. So I've started with some Tesseract Glow, which is a contrast paint. I just sort of dab it on in a roughly, you know, chemical spillage shaped blob. But it didn't come out as bright as I'd hoped on first pass, so I decided to highlight it a bit. So the first thing I've done is take some Elysian green, dab that on into sort of the middle of some of these splodgy blobs that I made. And then following that, I've taken a really bright yellow, Flash Gits yellow, and just put that, some pinpricks of that right in the middle of that green, just to give it a bit more pop. But after our sponging of the dirt on from before, I was a little bit unhappy with how much it had dampened down some of our highlights. So I'm going back in with a final dry brush, this time with Rakarth Flesh, which is sort of a slightly warmish off-white colour, just to really get those highlights to come out again, so we have that nice juxtaposition of the dirty grime against the highlights on the edges that will make these bases look really nice from a distance. And there we go, all done. So the final thing then is just do the rims in black. I wouldn't normally explain to people how to rim the edge of a base here, but I just wanted to say that I'm doing it in such a way that I leave the edge highlight just at the edge of the base there, so you get that crisp pop that I think makes these bases stand out from a distance. And there we have it. Underhive bases with some hazard stripes, some toxic goo, some grit and some grime. I'm really quite happy with how these turned out. Particularly the hazard stripes. The yellow and black that I've used here is reflected in what my Escher gang is wearing, and I think these are going to look really nice together when I finish the whole gang. So I really like my forces standing out on the tabletop because of having like a really nice unified basing scheme. So while these ones are for Necromunda, I think this is just going to be the first in a series of different basing guides I do for different types of armies. Perhaps we've got some forest bases, perhaps we'll do some ice and snow bases, those sorts of things. So if you're interested, like and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments what sort of basing tutorials you might like to see. Thanks for watching, see you next time.